She acted poor and naive. When meeting her billionaire fiancé's family, it turned out that, before we begin this journey, my beautiful family, I want to prepare your hearts for what is coming. In this story, you are going to witness the ultimate transformation. You will see a woman who was treated like a shadow in a room full of light, only to reveal that she was the one controlling the sun all along. You will watch as a family built on the hollow pillars of arrogance discovers that the charity case they mocked is actually the landlord of their very lives. Stay with me until the final act, because the moment Nora Vance stands at the head of a table that once refused her a seat is a moment of vindication you will never forget. This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about the silent power of a woman who knows her worth, even when the world is blind to it. Hi, my beautiful story family. Welcome home to Mr. James Stories. How is your heart doing today? I know the world can be loud and unkind, but I want you to know that you are seen and you are deeply valued. If no one has reminded you today, let me be the one. You are a pillar of strength, and your worth is not defined by those who fail to see it. May the Almighty shower you with a peace that surpasses all understanding, and may every tear you've shed in secret turn into a victory that the world cannot ignore. Drop a heart in the comments so I know you are here with me, and let's set all that aside and dive into another story together. The rain hit like bullets against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Vance Tower penthouse, but Nora wasn't there to hear it. Instead, she stood on a crumbling sidewalk 5 miles away, clutching a cardboard box that held the fragments of a life she was pretending to live. The wind tore at her thin sweater, a cheap acrylic blend that held no warmth. But she needed the chill. She needed to feel the bite of the world so she could remember why she was doing this. Nora was a woman who moved billions with a single keystroke in her real life. A silent powerhouse in the world of venture capital who preferred the shadows to the spotlight. But for the last 6 months, she had been Nora, the struggling freelancer, to Julian. She had wanted to find a man whose heart wasn't a ledger, someone who would see the woman behind the wealth. Julian had seemed like that man. At first, he was charming in a way that only old money can be, polished and effortless, with a laugh that sounded like a promise. But as the black gates of the Vance Manor swung open, Nora felt the first shiver of true doubt. The estate was a monument to a fading empire, all cold marble and ancient oil paintings of ancestors who looked as though they had never known the scent of a hard day's work. Julian led her through the grand foyer, his hand loosely holding hers, but his grip felt different today. It was lighter, less certain, as if he were already trying to detach himself from the pitiful girl at his side. "Just remember what I told you," Julian whispered, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "My mother values tradition. Don't mention the apartment. Just say you're between projects." Nora looked at him, her eyes searching his for a spark of the man who had read her poetry in her tiny, fake kitchen. "You mean my life, Julian? You want me to hide who I am?" "I want us to have a future," he snapped, his irritation flaring like a match in the dark. "And for that to happen, she needs to like you. Just play the part, Nora. Please." She nodded, the role of the naive girl settling over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. They entered the drawing room where Lady Catherine waited. The woman was an architectural marvel of silk and Botox, sitting on a velvet settee as if it were a throne. She didn't stand. She didn't smile. She simply raised a lorgnette and surveyed Nora's damp hair and scuffed shoes with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a new species of bacteria. "So," Catherine drawled, the scent of expensive jasmine trailing after her words. This is the little writer Julian has been hiding. I expected more. I'm Nora, ma'am, Nora said, her voice small and apologetic, exactly as the script required. It's an honor to meet you. Honor is a word for those who understand its weight, dear, Catherine replied, her gaze moving back to her son. Julian, she's drenched. The rugs in here are Persian. Have the staff take her to the servants' entrance to dry off. We shall dine in 20 minutes. Julian didn't protest. He didn't even look Nora in the eye. Of course, Mother. Nora, go with Thomas. He'll look after you. As Nora was led away through the back hallways, passing the very staff she would soon technically employ, she felt a cold clarity settle in her chest. The test had begun, and Julian had already failed the first question. Little did he know, this night wouldn't end with a wedding proposal, but with the total collapse of the world he thought he owned. This decision to treat her like a stain on his carpet would haunt him forever. The kitchen was a frantic theater of silver and steam, but Nora stood in the corner, ignored by the scurrying help. She dried her hair with a coarse towel, watching the clock. In her pocket, her phone vibrated, a text from her lead attorney. The takeover is complete, Ms. Vance. You are now the primary creditor for the Southern Thurland Bank. They are officially in your debt. Nora tucked the phone away, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips. She had come here to see if Julian was a man of character. She was getting her answer, but she was also getting a front-row seat to the destruction of a dynasty. She would walk into that dining room one last time as a victim. But when she walked out, she would be the one holding the keys to their kingdom. The servants' entrance was cold, smelling of floor wax and the damp, metallic scent of the heavy rain outside. Nora stood alone, the coarse towel in her hands, a sharp contrast to the Italian silk she usually wore against her skin. She could hear the muffled sounds of the drawing room through the heavy oak door, the tinkling of crystal, the low, refined murmur of voices that considered themselves superior to the very air she breathed. Is she gone? A voice hissed. It was Julian. Nora froze, her hand hovering over the door handle. She is in the kitchen, Julian. Do try to keep your voice down. Catherine's voice was like a blade wrapped in velvet. Honestly, where did you find this girl? She looks like she's never seen a silver spoon, let alone used one. She's a writer, Mother. She's soulful. Julian's defense was weak, lacking the fire of a man in love. Soulful doesn't pay for the upkeep of the Vance name, Julian, and it certainly won't help us with the bank audit. We need a girl with a dowry, not a girl with a thrift store dress and a cardboard box. Nora closed her eyes. The betrayal didn't sting as much as it clarified. She wasn't just testing Julian. She was witnessing the slow, agonizing death of a family's dignity. Little did Julian know, the soulful girl he was currently apologizing for was the only person on the planet who could stop the bank from seizing the very chair he sat on. Dinner is served, Thomas, the butler, announced, his voice startling Nora. He looked at her with a flicker of pity in his eyes, a look Nora filed away for later. Thomas would be kept on when she took over. The others would not. Nora smoothed her damp dress and walked into the dining room. The table was a sea of white linen and polished silver, enough to intimidate anyone who hadn't grown up in a boardroom. She took her seat at the far end, feeling the distance between her and Julian like a physical chasm. Nora, dear. Richard, Julian's father, began as the soup was served. He hadn't looked at her once since she entered. Julian tells us you live in that charming district near the docks. How do you find the commute? It's a long bus ride, sir, Nora said. keeping her voice soft, playing the role of the struggling artist. But the rent is what I can afford. Affordability. Such a quaint concept, Catherine remarked, sipping her wine. We've never really had to worry about that, until recently, of course. The table went silent, and the mention of their financial struggle was a breach of etiquette, a sign of how desperate they truly were. We've heard rumors, Nora said, dropping a micro hook into the conversation, that the bank is under new management. A venture capitalist, I think? Richard's spoon clattered against his bowl. Gossip, nothing more. The Vance name still carries weight in this city. He was lying, and Nora knew it. He didn't realize that his signature on the foreclosure papers was already sitting on her desk back at the penthouse. I hope so, Nora whispered. It would be a shame to lose all of this. We won't lose it, Julian snapped, finally looking at her. But his eyes weren't full of love. They were full of the fear of a man who realized his trophy wife had no gold to offer. And the main course arrived. Duck breast with a cherry reduction that smelled of expensive spices and arrogance. Nora watched as Catherine dissected her meal with surgical precision, her movements as cold as the marble foyer. So, Nora, Catherine started, not looking up. Tell us about your family. What does your father do? He was a teacher, ma'am. He passed away 5 years ago. A teacher? Catherine repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. And your mother? She manages a small flower shop. Flowers? How lovely, and how entirely useless in a crisis. Catherine looked at her son. Julian, you didn't tell me Nora's people were domestic. Mother, please, Julian muttered, his face flushing. Nora felt the atmospheric drop in the room. The scent of jasmine from Catherine's perfume was becoming suffocating. I think flowers are important, Nora said, her voice gaining a tiny bit of steel. They bring beauty to people who have nothing else. People who have nothing else usually need bread, dear, not carnations, Richard interjected. In this world, beauty is a luxury. Power is the only currency that matters. You'll learn that soon enough if you stay in Julian's circle. Though I suspect you won't. The insult was so direct, it left Nora breathless for a moment. She looked at Julian, waiting for him to stand, to shout, to tell his father that she was more than her bank account. He didn't. He took a sip of his wine and stared at the centerpiece. Nora is very talented, Julian said, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. She's working on a project. We are all working on projects, Julian, Catherine sighed. The question is which projects bear fruit. For instance, the new head of the Vance Trust, the one we haven't met yet. That is a person of substance. That is a person who understands how the world works. Nora smiled into her water glass. The person of substance was currently being told she wasn't good enough to sit at their table. I'm sure they do, Nora said. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you never see coming. True, Richard agreed. But they always wear the right clothes, Nora. Remember that? He pointed to her thrift store dress with his silver fork. The gesture was so dismissive, it felt like a slap. Little did he know, this very conversation was being recorded by the tiny device hidden in Nora's cheap pendant. Every word of their arrogance was being logged. A digital paper trail for the public humiliation she was planning. I'll remember, Nora said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. I'll remember everything about this night. The tension in the room was a living thing now. The open loop of the family's bankruptcy was tightening around their necks, and they were too busy insulting their savior to notice the noose. The dessert was a delicate soufflé, but to Nora, it tasted like cardboard. The verbal barbs had escalated from subtle to savage. "You know, Nora," Catherine began, leaning back as the staff cleared the plates, "Julian has a certain path laid out for him. Partnership at the firm, a seat on the board of the opera. These things require a wife who can navigate." "I can navigate, ma'am," Nora said. "Can you? You look like you'd get lost in a silk shop, dear. You have no poise, no pedigree. You're a freelancer, a wanderer. You're the kind of girl a man has a fling with before he settles down with someone of his own kind." Nora looked at Julian. "Is that what I am, Julian? A fling?" Julian's jaw tightened. "Mother is just being protective, Nora. She wants the best for me. And am I not the best for you?" The room went silent. The only sound was the rain lashing against the windows and the ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown. "Honestly, Julian," Richard spoke up, his voice booming, "the girl is evicted from her apartment every other month. She told us she was struggling. How can she be the best for anyone when she can't even manage her own rent?" Nora's heart hammered. This was the moment. The ruined girl was being put on trial. "I was evicted because I chose to help someone else with their debt." Nora lied smoothly, testing their empathy. "Then you are a fool," Catherine laughed. "In this house, we don't help people with debt. We acquire them. That is how empires are built." "Is it?" Nora asked. "And what happens when the empire is the one being acquired?" Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What is that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," Nora said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Just a writer's imagination." "Well, keep your imagination for your little stories," Catherine said, reaching into her silk clutch. "Because in the real world, imagination doesn't pay the bills. This does." She pulled out a small white envelope and placed it on the table. "There is $50,000 in there, Nora. More money than you've likely seen in your entire life. It's a gift, a parting gift." Nora stared at the envelope. "A parting gift?" "For leaving our son, for disappearing, for realizing that you are a liability to a family that is currently fighting for its survival." Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. "Take it and go back to your flowers and your bus rides. You don't belong here." Nora didn't reach for the envelope. She looked at Julian. This was his final chance. If he tore that envelope up, if he took her hand and walked out, she would save his family. She would wipe their debt clean and give him a life of real luxury. Julian looked at the envelope. He looked at his mother. Then he looked at Nora. "Take it, Nora," he whispered. I need time to think. Maybe my mother is right about our levels." The sound of Nora's heart breaking was drowned out by the thunder outside. The test was over. Julian had chosen $50,000 over the woman who was worth billions. This decision would haunt him forever. Nora didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, she let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since she first stepped onto the rain-slicked driveway. The air in the dining room felt different now. Thinner, colder, and charged with a truth that only she possessed. Julian was still looking at his plate, his cowardice practically radiating off him like a foul scent. "You need time to think, Julian?" Nora asked, her voice steady, devoid of the naive tremor she had used earlier. "Is that because your mother is doing the thinking for you? Or because you finally calculated that my thrift store dress doesn't match your family's dwindling bank account?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, girl. You are a guest in this house." "Am I?" Nora stood up. She didn't look like a struggling freelancer anymore. Her posture was straight, her chin tilted at an angle that whispered of boardrooms and power plays. Because from where I'm sitting, this house feels more like a mausoleum. You're all just ghosts haunted by a name you can no longer afford to keep. Catherine laughed, a brittle, jagged sound. The audacity of the poor. You see, Julian? This is what happens when you let a stray into the manor. They forget their place. My place is exactly where I choose to be, Nora said. She looked at the grandfather clock. And right now, I choose to be the one who tells you that your bank, the Sutherland Bank, is currently undergoing a forced audit. Richard turned ashen. How do you know about that? That information is strictly confidential. Gossip travels fast in the charming districts, Richard, Nora replied, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. But what the gossip didn't tell you is who triggered the audit. It wasn't the government. It was the primary creditor who bought out your debt 3 months ago. The shadow investor, Julian whispered, his head snapping up. Do you know them? Nora walked toward the door, stopping only to look back at the table of wolves. I know them better than anyone, and I know that they don't like being treated like a liability or trash. Whoever they are a professional, Catherine snapped, trying to regain her composure. They wouldn't care about a domestic dispute with a girl like you. Little do you know, Nora said, her voice dropping to a whisper that chilled the room. The shadow investor is very particular about who they do business with, and they find your family's brand of tradition to be a very poor investment. She walked out of the room, leaving the envelope of charity money untouched on the mahogany table. As she stepped into the foyer, her phone buzzed again. It was her assistant, Elena. Ms. Vance, the car is waiting at the end of the drive. The foreclosure papers are ready for your signature tomorrow morning. Nora didn't look back as she stepped into the storm. She didn't need a coat. The fire of Vindication was more than enough to keep her warm. The interior of the black limousine was a sanctuary of chilled air and the scent of expensive leather. Nora sat in the back, watching the Vance Manor shrink in the rearview mirror. She pulled the cheap acrylic sweater over her head, unrevealing a sleeveless silk top beneath, and wiped the rain from her face with a warm towel handed to her by the driver. Back to the penthouse, Ms. Vance? The driver asked. Yes, Marcus. And tell the legal team I want a full breakdown of Julian Sutherland's personal assets by dawn. The transition from Nora the naive girl to Nora the silent powerhouse was complete. She spent the drive reviewing the family's financials on an encrypted tablet. They were deeper in the red than even she had estimated. They were clinging to the manor through a series of bridge loans that Nora's fund now controlled. They were a house of cards, and she was the wind. When she reached her penthouse, the floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of the city's lights. Lights she technically owned a piece of. She stood on the balcony, near the rain now a gentle mist, and let the jasmine-scented night air wash away the stench of Catherine's perfume. Her thoughts turned to Julian. He had been a project, a hope that someone could see past the zeros in her bank account. But he had failed the ultimate test. He had chosen the safety of his mother's disapproval and a $50,000 bribe over a woman who would have saved his empire. He thinks he's attending the founder's gala with an heiress, Nora murmured to the empty room. She knew the woman he was referring to, Clara Beaumont, a woman whose family name was old, but whose pockets were just as empty as the Sutherlands. They were two drowning people clutching at each other, thinking they were reaching for a life raft. Nora walked to her dressing room. Tomorrow was the gala. The city's elite would be there, including the Sutherlands, who were likely spending their last few $1,000s on a table they couldn't afford. hoping to charm the shadow investor into a reprieve. "They want to meet the owner of their lives," Nora said, her reflection in the mirror looking back with cold, polished eyes. "I think it's only fair I grant them that wish." She pulled a garment bag from the rack. Inside was a gown of midnight blue silk, hand-stitched with microscopic crystals that captured the light like stars in a dark sky. It was a dress meant for a queen, not a freelancer. Little did Julian know, the soulful girl he had sent to the servants' entrance was about to become the most powerful person in the room. And this time, there would be no thrift store rags to hide behind. Morning in the Vance Tower was a symphony of ringing phones and sharp commands. Nora sat at her mahogany desk, the very desk where the fate of the Sutherland Bank had been decided. "They called 3 times this morning, Miss Vance," Elena said, placing a crystal glass of sparkling water on the desk. "Richard Sutherland is desperate. He's asking for a meeting with the principal executive. Tell him the principal will see him at the gala tonight," Nora said, her pen gliding across a foreclosure notice. "And, Elena, make sure the Sutherland's table is moved. I want them in the back, near the kitchen doors." The irony was delicious. The family that had forced her to dry off in the kitchen would now spend their final night of high society watching the festivities from the edge of the service entrance. Nora spent the afternoon in a high-stakes board meeting, a contrast to the simple life she had described at dinner the night before. Here, men in $5,000 suits hung on her every word. Here, her soulfulness was measured in profit margins and market dominance. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the city, Nora began her emotional ritual of preparation. She bathed in oils of sandalwood and jasmine, the scent a far cry from the damp acrylic of the night before. Her stylist arrived, a man who worked only for royalty and Nora Vance. "You look like you're going to war, Nora," the stylist remarked as he pinned the midnight blue silk. "I am, Andre. I'm going to reclaim a debt that has been outstanding for far too long." The jewelry was the final touch, a necklace of black diamonds that felt like ice against her throat. No thrift store pendants today, no cardboard boxes, just the cold, polished weight of a woman who had won. She thought of the check Catherine had slid across the table. $50,000. To Catherine, it was a fortune used to discard a human being. To Nora, it was the amount she spent on the gala's floral arrangements. "Julian asked for time," Nora whispered to her reflection. "Tonight, time is the one thing I won't give him." The limousine arrived at 8 p.m. The gala was being held at the Grand Metropole, the very hotel owned by Nora's holding company. She was the hostess, the guest of honor, and the judge. As she stepped out onto the red carpet, the flashes of 100 cameras blinded her for a second. She didn't hide. She didn't hunch her shoulders. She walked with the grace of a silent powerhouse, her eyes fixed on the entrance where she knew Julian would be waiting, clutching his empty invitation, unaware that the woman he had broken was about to shatter his world. The ballroom of the Grand Metropole was a cathedral of excess, dripping in gold leaf and the scent of expensive lilies and white truffle. For Nora, walking through these doors was a homecoming. For the Sutherlands, it was a desperate last stand. She stood on the mezzanine, hidden by a marble pillar, watching the drama unfold below. Julian was there, looking frantic in a tuxedo that, upon closer inspection, was slightly frayed at the cuffs. Beside him stood Clara Beaumont, the appropriate heiress, dripping in family jewels that Nora knew were currently being appraised for auction, and they looked like a couple in a jewelry advertisement. But their eyes held the panicked darting of prey. "Where is the principal?" Richard Sutherland was barking at a harried event coordinator. "We were told we would have an audience tonight." "The principal executive is finishing a private briefing, sir," the coordinator replied, with a practiced, icy smile. "In the meantime, please enjoy your table." Nora watched as the coordinator led them away from the center of the room, past the governors and the tech moguls, all the way to the back. When the family realized they were being seated next to the swinging doors of the kitchen, the very place they had relegated Nora just 24 hours ago, Catherine's face turned a shade of purple that clashed horribly with her silk gown. "This is an insult," Catherine hissed, her voice carrying even over the string quartet. "Do you know who we are?" "I know exactly who you are, ma'am," the coordinator said, her voice devoid of warmth. "You are the guests at table 64. Enjoy the duck." Nora felt a cold shiver of satisfaction. The quiet betrayal wasn't just Julian's silence at dinner. It was the world finally reflecting his true value back at him. She looked down at her own hands, the skin pale and smooth, devoid of the dishwater redness she had faked for months. Little did Julian know, the nothing girl who had begged for his defense was currently the only reason he was even allowed inside this building. She saw Julian scan the room, his eyes lingering on the VIP section. He was looking for the shadow investor, the mysterious savior who could wipe away his father's debts with a single signature. He didn't realize that the signature he needed was the same one he had watched write Nora on a coffee-stained napkin months ago. "Are you ready, Miss Vance?" Marcus, her head of security, whispered behind her. "Not yet, Marcus. I want them to wait. I want them to feel the weight of their own insignificance first." Nora turned away from the balcony. She needed this hour of silence. She needed to let the Nora who had been hurt die completely, so that the Miss Vance who would execute justice could take her place. Nora retreated to the sanctuary of the executive suite, where the air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and old money. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting the midnight blue silk of her gown. The crystals caught the light, making her look like a creature made of starlight and ice. Her phone buzzed on the vanity. A voicemail from Julian. She hit play, her expression neutral. "Nora, I don't know if you're getting these. Look, about last night, I was under a lot of pressure. My mother, she doesn't understand our connection. I'm at the gala tonight. If you see this, come find me. I'll make it right, I promise." The desperation in his voice was pathetic. He wasn't calling because he missed her. He was calling because the time he had asked for had run out, and he was terrified of the darkness closing in on his family. He wanted his soulful girl back because she was the only thing in his life that didn't demand a bank statement. "He still thinks he has something to offer me," Nora whispered to her reflection. She thought about the $50,000 check sitting in her purse, the one Catherine had used to try and buy her soul. She would hand it back tonight, but the value of the paper would be very different when it was returned. "Ms. Vance, the keynote introduction begins in 5 minutes, Elena announced, entering the room with a tablet. "The Sutherlands have tried to bribe the head waiter for a better seat twice. He refused both times." "Good. Let them sit in the draft of the kitchen," Nora said, her voice dropping to that sophisticated, cinematic tone that signaled the start of the final act. "It will help them remember the scent of the help they so despise." Nora picked up her mask, a delicate filigree of black gold. Tonight was a masquerade, a fitting end to a relationship built on a lie. Julian had fallen in love with a mask of poverty. Tonight, he would meet the face of power. Little did he know, his soulful writer was about to pen the final chapter of his family's history. She walked out of the suite, her heels clicking against the marble with the rhythm of a firing squad. She wasn't just a guest at this gala. She was the owner of the venue, the sponsor of the evening, and the architect of the Southern Netherlands ruin. The transition from the mezzanine to the backstage area was seamless. Nora moved through the shadows of the stage wings, watching the crowd through the velvet curtains. The ballroom was a sea of masks and diamonds, a glittering cage for the city's elite. In the back, at table 64, she saw the Southern Netherlands. Richard was nursing a drink with a grimace, while Catherine was fanning herself with a program, her eyes scanning the stage with a mix of hope and terror. Julian sat between them, looking like a man awaiting a verdict. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies' voice boomed over the speakers. "Tonight, we are honored to host the visionary behind the Vance Global Fund, a leader who has redefined the landscape of our city's finance. Please join me in welcoming our keynote investor, the shadow of the Vance Tower, Ms. Nora Vance." The room erupted in applause. Nora felt the atmospheric drop as the house lights dimmed and a single, brilliant spotlight hit the center of the stage. She stepped out, the midnight blue silk of her gown flowing behind her like a trail of ink. She didn't wear the mask anymore. She wanted them to see her face. She wanted there to be no mistake. She saw the moment it happened. In the back of the room, table 64 went still. Julian stood up so quickly his chair toppled over, the clatter echoing in the sudden silence of their shock. Catherine's fan stopped mid-air. Richard's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor, the same way Nora's heart had shattered in their dining room the night before. Nora reached the microphone. She looked directly at the back of the room, her eyes locking onto Julian's pale, horrified face. "Good evening," she began, her voice amplified and echoing, carrying the weight of a silent powerhouse. "Tonight, we talk about investment. We talk about the value of things that cannot be seen on a balance sheet. We talk about character." The room was pin-drop quiet. Every billionaire, every socialite, and every bully in the room was hanging on her every word. "I spent the last 6 months undercover," Nora continued, her gaze never leaving Julian's. "I wanted to see what happened when a person of no pedigree and no assets stood before the so-called elite of this city. I wanted to see who would offer a hand, and who would offer a bribe to make me disappear." At table 64, Catherine looked as though she might faint. Julian was trembling, his hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth. He realized now. He realized that the charity case he had sent to the servants' entrance was the woman who held his entire future in her hands. "I found my answer," Nora said, her voice turning cold and polished. "And tonight, I am acting on that data." The applause for Nora's speech was deafening, a roar of approval from the very people Julian's father had spent decades trying to impress. But for Julian, the sound was a funeral dirge. He stood paralyzed at table 64, the scent of the nearby kitchen, grease and steam, clinging to his expensive wool tuxedo like a brand of shame. His mother, Catherine, had collapsed back into her chair, her face a mask of porcelain white horror. As Nora stepped off the stage, disappearing into a swarm of photographers and city council members, Julian felt a surge of adrenaline fueled by pure, unadulterated desperation. He ignored his father's hushed commands to sit down and pushed his way through the crowd. He had to reach her. He had to explain. He had to fix the unfixable. He found her in the VIP lounge, a space cordoned off by velvet ropes and 2 massive security guards who looked at Julian with the same indifference one might show a stray dog. "Nora! Nora, please!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The security guard stepped forward, their shadows eclipsing him. But Nora raised a single, gloved hand. The guard stepped back instantly. "Let him in," Nora said. Her voice was cold, polished, and lacked even a hint of the warmth he had grown accustomed to in her struggling apartment. Julian stumbled into the lounge. The air here smelled of sandalwood and the most expensive jasmine, a scent that now felt like a suffocating reminder of his failure. He looked at Nora, the midnight blue silk of her gown, the black diamonds at her throat, and realized he had never actually seen her at all. "Nora." "I didn't know," he gasped, his hands shaking. "The things I said, the things my mother did. We thought you were in trouble. We were just trying to protect the family name." "Protecting a name that I now own, Julian?" Nora asked, her gaze steady. "You didn't know I was a billionaire, so you treated me like trash. That is the point of the test. You only offer respect to those you fear or those you want something from." "I love you," Julian whispered, a pathetic attempt to use the one weapon he thought he had left. Nora walked toward him, the crystals on her dress catching the light like shards of ice. "You loved the idea of a girl who made you feel superior. You loved a soul that didn't cost you anything. But when your mother offered a check to buy my exit, you didn't choose love. You chose $50,000 and time to think." "I'll make it right," Julian begged. "I'll marry you tomorrow. We don't need a prenup. I'll show the world." "The world already saw, Julian," Nora interrupted, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And little did you know, while you were thinking at that dinner table, my legal team was finalizing the seizure of your father's primary holdings. You aren't here to negotiate a marriage. You're here to witness a foreclosure." She turned her back on him, signaling the guards. The quiet betrayal was now a public execution. While Julian was being escorted from the VIP lounge, the atmosphere at table 64 had shifted from shock to a cold, predatory panic. Richard Sutherland was on his phone, his voice a frantic hiss as he spoke to his CFO. "What do you mean, frozen? We have credit lines. We have the Vance Trust." Richard slammed his phone onto the table, rattling the silver. "Richard, what is happening?" Catherine asked, her voice trembling. "That girl, she can't truly have the power to—" "She doesn't just have the power, Catherine. She is the bank," Richard snapped. "The audit isn't a formality. It's a liquidation. Every asset we have, the cars, the art, the estate, it's all being used as collateral for debts she now holds." The sensory details of their world began to sour. The champagne tasted like vinegar. The silk of Catherine's gown felt like a shroud. They were surrounded by the elite, yet they had never been more alone. Creditors who had been their friends an hour ago were now looking at them with the practiced distance of people avoiding a sinking ship. Nora watched this from the shadows of the mezzanine. She felt a flicker of the silent powerhouse within her, Har, the one who fought back with silence and success rather than screaming. She wasn't just taking their money. She was stripping away the delusion that their arrogance was backed by anything real. "The first phase of the audit is complete, Ms. Vance," Elena reported, standing beside her with a tablet. "The Sutherland Manor has been appraised. We can move for immediate eviction based on the breach of the primary loan covenant." "Wait until tomorrow morning," Nora said, her eyes fixed on Catherine, who was frantically trying to catch the eye of a senator's wife. "I want them to have one last night in that house. I want them to look at every painting and every piece of silver and know that it no longer belongs to them." Nora felt the weight of her own resilience. She had lived simply to find a man of character, and though she had found a coward instead. The process had sharpened her own sense of justice. Little did the Southerners know, their ruin wasn't just a business move. It was a ritual of vindication for every naive girl they had ever looked down upon. "And Julian?" Elena asked. "Leave him to the tabloids for now," Nora replied. "He wanted levels. Tomorrow, he will find out exactly how deep the bottom level goes." Nora returned to her penthouse as the first light of dawn began to bleed over the city skyline. She shed the midnight blue gown, the armor of ambition that had served her so well at the gala. Standing in her glass tower, surrounded by the cold, polished marble and the scent of expensive jasmine, she felt a strange mix of peace and exhaustion. The test was over. The villains were publicly humiliated, or in the silent powerhouse had thrived. But as she looked at her reflection, she saw the traces of the girl who had stood in the rain, hoping for a kind word from a man who didn't exist. "He's calling again, Miss Vance," Marcus said, standing at the door to her dressing room. "Block the number, Marcus. Block all of them." Nora walked to her balcony. Below, the city was waking up. Somewhere in the wealthy district, the Southerners were likely waking up to the sound of process servers at their gate. They would be forced to trade their silk for polyester and their boardrooms for courtrooms. She thought about the golden daughter, Clara Beaumont. News had already broken that the Beaumont family had officially severed ties with the Southerners. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, a bankruptcy was more contagious than a plague. Julian was now officially a liability to everyone he had ever known. Nora felt a micro-hook of curiosity about her own future. She had won the war, but the quiet betrayal had left a void that billions couldn't fill. She needed to build something new, something that wasn't based on tests or hidden identities. "Elena!" Nora called out, her voice regaining its warm, intimate tone as she spoke to her trusted friend. "Call the architect. I want to start the conversion of the manor immediately. I don't want it to be a museum of arrogance anymore. I want it to be a place of hope." As the sun rose higher, casting golden shadows across the Vance Tower, Nora knew that the next chapter of her life would be different. She would no longer be the girl in the thrift store dress, nor would she be the woman hiding behind a mask of starlight and ice. She was Nora Vance, a woman who had learned that true power wasn't in what you owned, but in your ability to survive the people who tried to make you feel like nothing. Little did Julian know, his signature on that coffee-stained napkin months ago wouldn't be his ticket to a billionaire's heart. It would be the primary evidence used in the audit that would eventually cost him his freedom. The Grand Metropole was still buzzing, but for the Southerners, the air had turned toxic. News of Nora's speech had traveled through the ballroom like a wildfire, fueled by the whispers of the city's most influential gossips. Julian stood near the exit, his eyes fixed on the elevator banks where Nora had disappeared. He felt exposed, his frayed cuffs and desperate expression finally visible to a world that had once bowed to his name. "Julian, we have to go," Catherine hissed, grabbing his arm. Her emerald ring, usually a symbol of her status, felt like a lead weight. "People are staring. That woman has made a mockery of us." "She didn't make a mockery of us, Mother," Julian replied, his voice hollow. "We did that ourselves." As they attempted to reach the main entrance, they found their path blocked, not by the crowd, but by the very gala gates they had once walked through with such arrogance. Two men in dark, tailored suits, Nora's security, stood firm at the threshold. "The Southerners party is requested to wait for a private escort," one of the men said. "Escort, we are leaving," Richard boomed, trying to summon the ghost of his former power. "Move aside, Mr. Aunt Vance has requested that you stay until the final tally of the evening is settled," the guard replied. The use of Mr. Vance sent a jolt of electricity through the family. Nora wasn't just using her mother's name or a pen name. She was operating under the full weight of the Vance legacy, a name that made their own look like a footnote. The family was ushered into a side parlor, a room with cold marble floors and a single, flickering lamp. It was a holding cell dressed in luxury. Little did Julian know, the private escort wasn't to lead them to their car, but to ensure they were present for the final blow. Nora watched them through the security feed in her suite. She saw Catherine pacing like a caged animal, and Richard staring at the door. Julian, however, sat in a chair, his head in his hands, and he looked like a man who had finally realized that levels worked both ways. "Are the papers served?" Nora asked Elena. "The process servers are waiting at the manor gates, Miss Vance, and the press has been tipped off that the shadow investor will be making a statement regarding the Southern Thurland Bank's insolvency at dawn." Nora felt the atmospheric drop in her own heart. This was the public destruction she had planned, the moment the villains would be exposed. But she didn't feel the joy she expected. She felt a grim, silent satisfaction. The quiet betrayal was about to meet a very loud conclusion. Nora decided to face them one last time before the world tore them apart. She changed into a simple, charcoal gray suit, the kind an executive wears when she's about to fire an entire department. She walked into the parlor, her heels clicking with a rhythm that made Catherine jump. "Nora," Julian whispered, standing up. "It's Miss Vance," she corrected him, her voice a sophisticated, cinematic purr that lacked any of the warmth he'd once known. "You can't do this," Richard said, his voice cracking. "We have decades of history in this city. You'll destroy your own reputation by being this vindictive." "My reputation is built on results, Richard. Yours was built on a lie," Nora replied. She looked at Catherine. "How was the duck? I heard table 64 had a particularly good view of the kitchen staff." Catherine's eyes flashed with a dying spark of rage. "You think you've won because you have money? You're still just a girl who lived in a hovel to trick my son." "I lived in a hovel to see who your son was when no one was watching," Nora said, turning to Julian. "And I saw a man who asked for time to decide if I was worth $50,000. Little did you know, Julian, the woman you were weighing against a check was the one who had already bought your family's debts to keep you from the streets. Until tonight." "Nora, please, I can change," Julian begged. "Change is for people who have something to grow from, Julian. You're hollow." The door opened, and a man in a police uniform entered, followed by two men in suits. "Richard Southern-Thurland? We have a warrant for your arrest regarding the fraudulent inflation of asset values at the Southern-Thurland Bank." The security standoff was over. The family was being dismantled in the very room where they had hoped for a rescue. Nora stood back, her expression unreadable. She saw the moment the handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists, the sound of a dynasty ending. Catherine let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. Julian just looked at Nora, his eyes full of a regret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You chose the wrong side of the table, Julian," Nora said. "And now you don't have a table at all." As Richard was led away, the parlor felt colder than the rain-slicked streets outside. Catherine was hysterical, her silk gown crumpled as she clung to Julian. But Julian seemed to have finally found his silence. Not the silence of a coward, but the silence of a man who realized there were no words left to save him. Nora walked out of the room, her security detail forming a phalanx around her. She passed the gala's main entrance, where the golden daughter, Clara Beaumont, was being whisked away by her own family, her emeralds glinting like the eyes of someone who had just escaped a shipwreck. The press was waiting outside the metropole. Flashbulbs exploded, creating a sensory overload of white light and shouting voices. Nora didn't stop. She didn't speak. She let her silence do the talking. "Miss Vance, is it true you've liquidated the Southern Thurland Bank? Nora, what do you have to say to the families who lost their savings under Richard's management?" She climbed into her limousine, the door closing with a heavy, expensive thud that shut out the world. "To the manor, Marcus," she said. "The manor, Miss Vance? Are you sure?" "I want to be there when they arrive," Nora replied. "I want to be standing in the foyer when they realize the servants' entrance is the only door left open for them." The drive was quiet. Nora looked at the black diamond on her finger, a gift she had bought for herself when she reached her first billion. It was a reminder that she didn't need a man to provide her with a pedigree. She had built her own. Little did Julian know, the quiet betrayal he had committed at dinner was the catalyst for a total reconfiguration of the city's power structure. By the time the sun rose, the Vance name would be the only one that mattered. And the Southern Thurlands would be a cautionary tale told in the very boardrooms where they once reigned supreme. Nora felt a micro-hook of anticipation. The climax was near, and the silent powerhouse was ready to close the final open loop of her justice. She was no longer the girl in the thrift store dress. She was the architect of a new world, and the wolves were about to find out exactly what happened when they tried to devour their master. The manor was no longer a fortress. It was a museum of a dead era. Nora stood in the center of the foyer, her charcoal suit a sharp contrast to the gilded frames and velvet drapery. The house was unnaturally silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock that seemed to be counting down the seconds of the Southern Thurland legacy. She looked at the servants' entrance, the narrow, drafty door where she had been forced to dry off like a stray animal just days ago. The front doors burst open, and the silence was shattered. Julian stumbled in, supported by a sobbing Catherine, except they looked like ghosts of the people who had sat at the head of the table. Julian's tuxedo was rumpled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. He stopped dead when he saw Nora standing under the crystal chandelier. "Nora," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" "The police. They took my father. They said the bank is gone." "I told you, Julian," Nora said, her voice echoing off the marble. "I'm the principal, and as the principal, I am here to personally oversee the transition of this property." Catherine let out a gasp that sounded like a physical wound. She clutched the back of a Louis XIV chair as if it could save her from the truth. "This is our home. You can't just walk in here and—" "It's not your home, Catherine," Nora interrupted, or her voice turning cold and polished. "It hasn't been yours since your husband signed the bridge loan agreement 3 months ago. You've been living on my grace, and tonight I've decided that my grace has reached its limit." The gasp that escaped Julian's lips was the sound of a man finally understanding the height of the cliff he had fallen from. He looked at the walls, the art, the silver, everything he had used to measure his superiority over Nora, and realized it was all hers. "The check," Catherine stammered, reaching into her bag with trembling hands. "The 50,000, take it back. We'll make it right, Nora. Julian loves you." Nora walked toward her, her heels clicking with a rhythm that felt like a verdict. She took the white envelope from Catherine's shaking fingers. "You used this to try and buy my soul, Catherine. You thought my worth was $50,000. Little did you know, I spent $50,000 this morning just to ensure the press was waiting at your gates." Nora tore the envelope in half and let the pieces flutter to the marble floor. "Keep your charity. You're going to need it where you're going." The atmospheric drop in the foyer was palpable. The scent of Catherine's expensive jasmine was replaced by the smell of rain and ozone drifting in through the open front doors. Outside, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi began to strobe against the windows, a silent, flickering judgment. "Julian," Nora said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate tone that felt like a secret between them. "Do you remember what you said at dinner? You said you needed time to think because your mother was right about our levels." Julian looked at her, tears streaming down his face. "I was a coward, Nora. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't pay the interest on $1 billion debt, Julian," Nora replied. "And time is a luxury only the wealthy can afford. You are no longer wealthy." Marcus stepped forward, handing Nora a leather-bound folder. She opened it and pulled out a single, embossed document. The stage was set for the final act of vindication. "This is a formal notice of eviction," Nora stated, her voice projecting with the authority of a silent powerhouse. "The Southern Thurland Manor is being converted into a non-profit foundation for under-resourced women. The transition begins at dawn. You have 1 hour to pack whatever personal items can fit into a single suitcase." "1 hour?" Catherine shrieked. "Everything in this house is an heirloom." "Everything in this house is an asset of the Vance Trust," Nora corrected her. "Including the pearls around your neck, Catherine. I believe they were used as collateral for the second mortgage Richard took out in June." The humiliation was total. Julian looked at Nora, searching for a spark of the girl who had read poetry in her fake kitchen. But she was gone. The silent powerhouse had taken her place, and she was as unyielding as the marble beneath their feet. "Why are you doing this?" Julian begged. "If you ever loved me." "Because I loved you. I wanted to see who you were without the money," Nora said. "And I found out you were nothing." "I'm not being cruel, Julian. I'm being honest. You wanted levels? So's welcome to the bottom one." The hour passed in a blur of frantic packing and hushed arguments. Nora stood on the grand staircase, watching as the family that had once called her trash scrambled to save fragments of their former lives. Catherine emerged with a designer suitcase, her face a mask of bitter resentment. Julian followed, carrying a single box. "Is that it?" Nora asked from the stairs. "It's all I have that's actually mine," Julian said, his voice a whisper. Nora walked down the stairs, meeting them in the foyer. The spotlight of the world was waiting outside, and she was about to push them into it. "Marcus, open the gates," Nora commanded. The heavy iron gates of the manor groaned open. The press surged forward, and their cameras ready for the spotlight drop. The moment the city's most arrogant scion was revealed as a bankrupt fraud. "Walk out the front door, Julian," Nora said, the same way I walked in. "But this time, don't look back. There's nothing left for you here." Julian took a step toward the door, then stopped. He looked at Nora one last time. "You were the best thing I ever had, Nora. And I threw it away for a house I didn't even own." "You threw it away for a mask of superiority, Julian. You didn't lose a house. You lost yourself," Nora replied. As the Southern Thurlands walked out into the barrage of camera flashes and shouting reporters, Nora stood in the center of the foyer, finally alone. The open loops were closing, one by one. The villains were publicly destroyed, and the silent powerhouse was left with the ruins of an empire she would now rebuild into something meaningful. Little did Julian know, the very man who had helped him carry his bags out, the guard Marcus, was already instructed to give the family exactly $1,000 from Nora's personal account. Not for charity, but as a reminder of the pittance they had tried to give her. Nora walked to the grandfather clock and stopped the pendulum. The Sutherland time had officially run out. She turned her back on the front door and walked toward the library, her heels clicking a final, triumphant rhythm on the cold, polished marble. The morning sun didn't just rise over the city. It illuminated the wreckage of the Sutherland name. Nora stood in the library of the manor, the air thick with the scent of old paper and the lingering jasmine of a woman who no longer lived there. Outside the tall oak doors, the world was screaming. The press had turned the front lawn into a circus of flashing lights and shouted questions. But inside, the silence was a masterpiece. Nora walked to the podium she had ordered to be placed in the grand foyer. It was time for the speech of fire. This wasn't a corporate briefing. It was a reclamation. She signaled to Marcus, and the front doors were thrown open once more. The roar of the crowd surged in, but Nora didn't flinch. She stepped into the spotlight of 100 cameras, her charcoal suit looking like armor against the morning light. "Good morning," she began, her voice amplified and echoing, carrying the sophisticated weight of a woman who had won. For years, this house stood as a monument to a name that valued pedigree over people. Today, that monument is being dismantled. She looked directly into the lenses of the cameras, knowing that Julian and Catherine were likely watching from a cheap motel room or the back of a police car. "I spent months living as a girl with nothing, testing the character of those who claimed to be the pillars of our society." Nora continued, her eyes flashing with a predatory brilliance. "I found that their pillars were hollow, built on the stolen lives of their creditors and the arrogance of their bloodline. They called me trash. They called me a liability. Little did they know, a liability is only a problem if you can't afford to pay for it. And I can afford everything." The gasp of the room, or rather, the entire city, was a sound Nora would cherish forever. "Effective immediately, the Sutherland Bank is liquidated," she announced, her voice turning cold and polished. "Every asset will be redistributed to the families Richard Sutherland defrauded. And this manor? It will no longer be a palace for bullies. It is now the Vance Foundation for resilience." She stepped back from the podium as the reporters erupted in a frenzy. She didn't stay for the questions. She had said everything the silent powerhouse needed to say. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of the end for anyone who thought they could buy their way out of a bankrupt soul. The final foreclosure wasn't just about the physical building. It was the total erasure of the Sutherland influence. Nora spent the afternoon in the manor's study, in watching as movers began to tag the Louis XIV furniture and the oil paintings of ancestors who had likely been just as cruel as Catherine. "The personal accounts have been drained, Miss Vance," Elena reported, her tablet glowing in the dim library light. "Catherine Sutherland tried to use a hidden offshore account in the Caymans an hour ago. We intercepted it and redirected the funds to the victim's pool." "Good," Nora said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "Leave them with the one thing they hate most, a life they have to earn." Nora walked to the window. In the distance, she could see the silhouette of the city's financial district, the boardrooms where Richard had once felt like a god. Now, he was likely sitting in a gray cell, realizing that the nothing girl had been the only one with the power to save him. She thought of Julian, and he had called her 30 times in the last 4 hours. She didn't answer. There was no quiet betrayal left to discuss. He had asked for time, and time had delivered its verdict. "Miss Vance, Julian is at the gate," Marcus whispered, appearing in the doorway. "He's refusing to leave. He says he just needs 5 minutes." "Let him in, Marcus," Nora said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "But search him first. I want to make sure he isn't carrying any more of his mother's charity." The atmosphere in the study shifted as Julian was led in. He looked smaller than he had at the gala, his pride replaced by the frantic, sweat-stained desperation of a man who had lost his orbit. He didn't look at the tagged furniture. He only looked at Nora. "You did it," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "You took everything." "I didn't take anything, Julian. I simply stopped paying for the lies you told yourselves," Nora replied, her gaze as unyielding as the marble floors. "I'll do anything," Julian begged, falling to his knees, a status play that Nora found more pathetic than vindicating. "I'll work for you. I'll be your driver. Just don't let my mother starve. She's old, Nora." "She isn't too old to learn how to work, Julian," Nora said. "And you? You're not a driver. A driver needs to know where he's going. You've been lost your whole life." Little did he know. His plea was being broadcast to the legal team in the next room, ensuring that every word of his desperation was logged as proof that he no longer had the standing to contest the foreclosure. Julian stayed on his knees, his hands trembling as he reached for the hem of Nora's charcoal suit, a gesture she avoided by stepping back toward the mahogany desk. The room felt intimate and warm in the way a funeral parlor might. It was the scent of the end. "Nora, please. There has to be some part of you that remembers us," Julian pleaded, his voice a ragged whisper. "The nights in the apartment, the poetry. It was real for me. It was real for you because you thought I was something you could protect and control," Nora said, her voice turning sophisticated and cinematic. "You loved the writer because she made you feel like a hero. But a hero doesn't sit silent while his mother offers a bribe. A hero doesn't ask for time to see if a woman is worth his social standing." She leaned over the desk, her face inches from his. "I wasn't a project, Julian, and I was the architect. And you were just a flaw in the design." "What happens to me now?" he asked, his eyes wide and hollow. "You live the life you thought I lived," Nora stated, her voice devoid of empathy. "You live in a charming district. You take the bus. You count your pennies. And every time you see a girl in a thrift store dress, I want you to wonder if she's the one who's going to buy your next job." Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand on Julian's shoulder. It was the signal that the backstage confrontation was over. Julian didn't fight. He stood up slowly, his movements like those of an old man. He walked toward the door, stopping only once to look back at the room that had once been his kingdom. "I would have loved you, Nora," he said, one last lie to save his pride. "God, you would have loved the version of me you could own," Nora corrected him. "But you can't own the wind, Julian. You can only watch it blow your house down." As he was led away, Nora felt the final open loop of her anger begin to settle. She had survived the wolves, and she had thrived. Little did Julian know, the $50,000 check he had refused to tear up was already being used to fund the first month of the women's shelter that would occupy his childhood bedroom. She sat in the high-backed leather chair, the silence finally becoming a sanctuary. The villains were publicly destroyed, and the silent powerhouse had claimed her throne. The study was quiet after Julian was let out, but the silence didn't last long. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and Lady Catherine stepped inside. She had stripped away her arrogance, along with her jewelry, appearing smaller and more fragile than Nora had ever seen her. The cold, polished exterior she had maintained at the dinner was gone, replaced by the frantic, raw desperation of a woman who realized she was about to be erased. "Nora," she began, her voice cracking as she neared the mahogany desk. "Please, I am an old woman. This house, it is the only world I know." Nora didn't look up from the tablet she was using to authorize the final transfer of the estate's titles. "It was a world built on the exclusion of others, Catherine. You told me honor was a word for those who understand its weight. Do you feel the weight now?" Catherine fell into a chair, the very one Nora had been forbidden from sitting in during her first visit. "I was wrong about you. I see that now. You have the steel of a true Vance. We could be allies. If you marry Julian, we can merge the names. The scandal would vanish." Nora finally looked up, her gaze as sharp as a diamond. "You aren't offering me a merger, Catherine. You're offering me a corpse. The Southern Thurland name is a liability I've already written off. And as for Julian, he's a man who needs a mother, not a wife." "Think of the tradition," Catherine pleaded, her hands clutching the air. "The history of this family." "I am thinking of history," Nora said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate hum. "I'm thinking of every woman you've ever looked down upon because her dress wasn't silk. I'm thinking of the flowers my mother sells that you called useless. Tomorrow, this library will be cleared to make room for a vocational center. Code, your tradition ends at dawn." Catherine realized then that there was no ice king coming to save her. No powerful man who would be gentle with her because of her status. She was facing a silent powerhouse she had created through her own cruelty. Little did she know, the very pearls she had bragged about were already being packaged for a charity auction to fund the legal fees of the people her husband had cheated. "Get out, Catherine," Nora whispered, the words echoing with the finality of a closing vault. "Take your suitcase and find a life that isn't built on someone else's debt." The morning of the eviction arrived with a gray, unrelenting drizzle that matched the mood of the manor. Nora stood on the front steps, watching as the black gates she had once stood outside in rags swung open for a fleet of white vans. And these weren't movers for the Southern Thurlands. They were the Vance Foundation staff, ready to begin the transformation. Julian and Catherine stood on the gravel driveway, each holding a single suitcase. They looked like refugees from a war they had started. The arrogant bullies were now just two people in the rain, stripped of their cold, polished aesthetics. "Here," Nora said, stepping down to hand Julian a final document. He took it with trembling fingers. "What is this? Another lawsuit?" "It's an eviction notice for the downtown penthouse you thought was your backup plan," Nora stated, her voice projecting with the authority of a woman who had won. "I bought that building last night. You have until noon to clear out. After that, the locks will be changed." Julian looked at the paper, then at the manor. Where are we supposed to go?" "You told me once that people who have nothing else usually need bread," Nora reminded him, her eyes as cold as the morning mist. "I suggest you find a bakery. And Julian, the bus stop is at the end of the road. I believe the fare is $2. Try not to be late." The press was waiting at the edge of the property, their lenses capturing every second of the family's fall. As Julian and Catherine began the long walk down the driveway, the spotlight drop was complete. They weren't just poor, they were publicly exposed as the architects of their own ruin. Nora watched them go, her posture dignified and resilient. She didn't feel the need to scream or gloat. The silence of her success was the loudest noise in the city. Little did Julian know, the bus he was about to board was owned by a transit company Nora had acquired 3 weeks ago. Even his retreat was happening on her terms. The final blow to Julian's pride came not from Nora, but from the very woman he had chosen as her appropriate replacement. Clara Beaumont, the heiress who had stood by him at the gala, appeared at the manor gates just as Julian was reaching the end of the drive. She didn't get out of her car. She simply rolled down the window of her silver sedan, the scent of expensive perfume drifting out into the rain-slicked street. "Julian," she said, her voice devoid of the affection she had performed just 48 hours ago. "My father saw the news. The Beaumonts cannot be associated with a bankruptcy of this magnitude. Clara, please. I just need a place to stay for a few days," Julian begged, his hand reaching for the car door. She locked it with a sharp, electronic click. "We were an arrangement, Julian, and the terms of that arrangement have changed. You're no longer an asset. You're a liability." The rival's exit was as cold and polished as the world they inhabited. She pulled away, the tires of her car splashing muddy water onto Julian's only remaining suit. He was left standing in the rain, a man who had traded $1 billion heart for a silk-wrapped vacuum. Nora watched this from the mezzanine window, her expression unreadable. She saw the moment Julian's shoulders finally slumped, the moment the arrogant bully was finally broken. He looked back at the manor one last time, his eyes searching for the woman he had sent to the servants' entrance. But Nora had already turned away. She was walking toward the library, or her mind focused on the future. She had closed the loops of the past, and now it was time to build a sanctuary from the wreckage. "Miss Vance," Marcus said, appearing at the door. "The first group of women from the shelter has arrived. They're waiting in the foyer." "Tell them welcome home, Marcus," Nora said, a genuine smile finally touching her lips. "And tell them the servants' entrance is permanently closed. From now on, everyone walks through the front door." Little did Julian know, as he boarded the bus with his sobbing mother, that his signature on Nora's parting gift had been the final piece of evidence needed to freeze his family's offshore trusts forever. He had sold his soul for $50,000, and now he had neither. The manor was finally quiet, the kind of silence that only follows a violent storm. Nora stood in the grand foyer, the charcoal gray of her suit matching the overcast sky visible through the open front doors. The press had retreated to the edge of the property, their long lenses still trained on the house like vultures waiting for a final scrap of scandal. Nora watched the dust motes dance in a single shaft of light that pierced through the clouds. This house, once a fortress of cold, polished arrogance, was now a hollow shell. Stripped of the jewelry and the pedigree that Catherine had clung to like a life raft. Elena walked toward her, her heels echoing on the marble floors that would soon be covered with durable, warm carpeting for the new residents. "The liquidation is nearly complete, Ms. Vance. The Southern Thurland name has been officially removed from the board of the opera. And the bank is being rebranded under your fund's umbrella. It's over." Nora nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the floor where she had torn Catherine's $50,000 check into pieces. "It's never really over, Elena. You don't just erase decades of cruelty with a few signatures. You have to build something over the ruins." She retreated to her penthouse that evening, the glass tower offering a panoramic view of the city she had quietly conquered. She poured a glass of wine and sat on the balcony, the scent of expensive jasmine from her own terrace garden, a reminder of the life she had built for herself, not the one she had performed for Julian. Her phone sat on the table, a constant stream of notifications flickering on the screen. At 3 a.m., The silence was broken. A notification for a new voicemail appeared. Nora hesitated, then hit play. The sound of weeping filled the room. A ragged, ugly sound that lacked any of the refined polish Julian had prized. "Nora, I'm at a motel on 4th Street. The bus, it was so crowded. My mother won't stop screaming. I keep thinking about the apartment. I keep thinking about the poetry. Why didn't you just tell me? Why did you let me walk into this?" Nora listened to the entire 3-minute message. He wasn't apologizing for his character. He was blaming her for his lack of it. He was mourning the loss of his comfort, not the loss of her. Little did he know. While he was weeping into a cheap pillow, Nora was already reviewing the first batch of applications for the women's shelter that would occupy his childhood home. She deleted the message without responding. The quiet betrayal was a closed loop. And she had no intention of reopening it for a man who still didn't understand that his choices, not her secrets, were the cause of his ruin. The final audit took place in the Vance Tower boardroom, a space characterized by its cold, polished, and expensive aesthetic. Nora sat at the head of the table, surrounded by her legal and financial teams. On the large monitors, the Southern Thurland's liquidated assets were displayed like a digital autopsy. Every hidden account, every offshore trust, and every piece of art had been accounted for. "They are truly ruined, Ms. Vance," the lead auditor stated. "Richard is facing 20 years for fraud. Catherine is living in a 1-bedroom apartment paid for by a distant cousin who hates her. And Julian? He's been blacklisted from every firm in the city." Nora looked at the final tally, and the destruction was total. A masterpiece of financial and social execution. The arrogant bullies had been stripped of their financial leverage and their dignity. But as Nora looked at the numbers, she made a decision that surprised even Elena. "The manor," Nora said, her voice dropping to that sophisticated, cinematic tone. "I want the transition accelerated. I want the shelter open by the end of the month. I want the Southern Thurland name chiseled off the cornerstone and replaced with resilience." She spent the rest of the day in the manor, overseeing the removal of the final heirlooms. She found a book of poetry in the library, one Julian had read to her in her fake kitchen. She opened it and found a dried flower pressed between the pages. A carnation, the useless flower Catherine had mocked. Nora felt a micro-hook of the past, a flicker of the girl who had wanted to be loved for herself. But she closed the book and handed it to a mover. "Donate this. Everything goes." Little did the Southern Thurlands know, their ruin wasn't just a business move. It was a public ritual of vindication. As Nora walked out of the study, she felt the weight of her own power, not as a burden, but as a shield for those who couldn't defend themselves. She was no longer a nothing girl. She was a sovereign. The headlines were brutal. "Billionaire scion dumped by secret boss, the fall of the Southern Thurland Empire." The tabloids were filled with photos of Julian boarding the bus and Catherine looking haggard in a cheap coat. The spotlight drop had become a permanent fixture in the city's gossip cycle. Nora sat in a quiet cafe in a district where no one recognized her, and reading the papers with a grim, silent satisfaction. She was dressed in a simple, expensive silk blouse and tailored trousers, the armor of a woman who no longer had to hide. Across the street, she saw a man who looked like Julian. He was wearing a drab, ill-fitting suit and was struggling with a heavy briefcase. For a second, her heart skipped. But then she realized it wasn't him. Julian was likely miles away, trying to figure out how to navigate a world that didn't care about his pedigree. "Is this seat taken?" a voice asked. Nora looked up. A man stood there, his expression kind, and his hands showing the calluses of someone who actually worked for a living. He didn't look like he belonged in a boardroom, but he didn't look like he belonged in a gutter either. "It's free," Nora said, her voice warm and intimate. They talked for an hour, and he was an architect working on a project for a nonprofit. He didn't ask for her last name. He didn't look at her watch. He simply listened to her talk about her love for the city and her hope for the future. It was the first real conversation she'd had in a year that wasn't a test. Little did she know, this encounter was the beginning of a different kind of story. One where she didn't have to be a silent powerhouse or a naive girl. She could just be Nora. But as she watched him walk away, she reminded herself of the lesson she had learned. True power is knowing who to trust when the spotlights are off. The Vance Foundation for Resilience opened its doors on a crisp autumn morning. Nora stood on the front lawn, surrounded by the women who would now call the manor home. The atmosphere was a complete reversal of the night of the dinner. One there was laughter, the scent of fresh bread, and the vibrant colors of flowers that Lady Catherine would have called domestic. Nora watched as the women walked through the front doors, the same doors that had once been closed to her. She felt a sense of completion, a bridge from the betrayal of the past to the purpose of the future. "You did it, Nora," Elena said, standing beside her. "You turned a monument to arrogance into a sanctuary." "We did it, Elena, and we're just getting started." As the ceremony concluded, a shadow appeared at the edge of the property. It was Julian. He was standing near the bus stop, looking at the manor with an expression of such profound loss that for a moment Nora felt a flicker of pity. But it was quickly replaced by the memory of his silence in the study. He began to walk toward her, but Marcus stepped forward, his presence an unyielding barrier. "Let him speak," Nora said, her voice clear and calm. Julian stopped a few feet away. He looked hollowed out, his Ice King exterior completely shattered. "I just wanted to see what you did with it. My father's study, it's a classroom now. It's a room where people learn to build lives, Julian. Something you never learned," Nora replied, her posture dignified. "I have nothing, Nora. I'm living in a boarding house. I'm working as a clerk." "Then you have a beginning," Nora stated. "Most people start there. You're just a few decades late." She turned her back on him, walking toward the women who were waiting for her. She didn't look back. The quiet betrayal was finally, truly, in the past. A month later, a knock came at the door of Nora's office at the foundation. She looked up from her paperwork to see a man standing there in a gray janitor's uniform. His hair was cut short, and his hands were stained with the dust of the manor's ongoing renovation. It was Julian. "I saw the 'Help Wanted' sign in the window," he said, his voice devoid of pride. "I thought, if I'm going to start at the bottom, I should start where I caused the most damage." Nora looked at him for a long time. She saw the man who had read poetry, the man who had been a coward, and now the man who was finally, desperately trying to be real. "The pay is minimum wage, Julian. You'll be scrubbing the floors you used to walk on with your nose in the air. You'll be taking orders from the women your mother called trash." "I know," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm not asking for a second chance at you, Nora. I'm asking for a first chance at being a man." Nora felt the final open loop click shut. This was the ultimate vindication. Not just destroying him, but forcing him to see the world from the servant's entrance he had relegated her to. "Marcus will show you where the supplies are," Nora said, her voice cold, but not cruel. "The foyer needs waxing. Start there." As Julian walked away to begin his shift, Nora stood at the window of the library. She saw the new architect, the man from the cafe, walking across the lawn to meet her. The silent powerhouse had claimed her justice, but Nora Vance had finally found her peace. Little did Julian know, the very floors he was about to wax were the ones where Nora had stood in the rain, deciding that no one would ever make her feel like nothing again. She had tested them, and they had failed. But in the ruins of their failure, she had built a masterpiece of her own making. Hi, my beautiful story family. Thank you for staying with me through this journey of resilience and justice. Remember, your value is never determined by those who try to keep you small. If your heart is true and your love is real, may you always find the strength to walk through the front door of your own destiny. Drop a heart in the comments if you believe in second chances for yourself, but never for those who refuse to see your worth. Subscribe to stay safe and stay strong. Until next time, let's keep starting with love always.